lecture on that, but I wanted to do another one that would also overlap with some of those ideas for all of you, and extend those ideas. I've lectured again in class face-to-face, and my face-to-face students had some questions and some concerns that I think will help me explain this a bit better to you all. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about too are the short stories. The short stories themselves, where do they come from? How do you access them? I've already discussed this, but I want to discuss that again with you all. If you go to your What is Literature module and scroll down, you'll find the research report assignment description, and that's what I'm looking at right now. That has your list of short stories. I'm not going to read the names of the short stories to you. You can read this yourself. You can find this document yourself. But you need to pick 3 of these stories if you haven't already and read them. I would say read more than 3. Not all these stories are very long. As you can see, some of them are only a page long, but they're very dense. They have a lot of ideas and concepts in them, and they'll seem to have even more ideas and concepts than before, considering the conversations we're having about them. So you need to read those stories. It's going to be very tough to write a quality essay for this essay without having read those stories. And it'll all make sense why that's important in a minute. So what you are doing now, the stage you should be at now, is creating a thesis statement. So I'm going to just put this box here. I'm going to try to use this Microsoft Office as a whiteboard. We'll see how well this works. So in 1301, I have my students use a specific formula for a thesis, and that's subject plus opinion. In the case of this essay, then, what we can start thinking about is how do we fill in the blanks for this formula? We know our subject is literature. So our subject is going to be literature. Let's make that bigger. And I'm going to change the font here. No. Our subject is going to be literature. And our opinion is going to be this definition our extended definition. Now, the question then becomes, where does this definition come from? How do we develop this definition? Well, if you've been doing the readings, you have 3 sources that would work well for this. You have Fry, you have Pound, and you have Kennedy and Jaoa. Kennedy and Jaoa are the editors of this textbook. And at this point, you should have read 2 sections at least in this text, really 3 sections. There's the chapter on theme, the chapter on symbol, and that chapter of critical approaches to literature or critical approaches to reading. It depends on your edition what the title of that chapter is. You should have read those at this point. And all these things, Fry, Pound, Kennedy, Jaoa, my lectures, the video from the Story of Life, that production company that did that video, all those things should be used to help you start to form a thesis statement that is following this formula. So your task is to define literature. Now, we will not use the dictionary because this is an extended definition. And really, when we think about dictionary definitions, they don't add anything to this conversation. They're going to say things like literature is printed text that is called literature, or something very circular like that, something that doesn't really help us better understand what these things are. And as you know from the lectures and from the discussion forum, the discussion board, we have a lot of debate as to what literature actually is. I mean, we have many students saying that it could be anything. We have some students saying that there's a difference between text that is scriptural, spiritual text like the Bible, and literary text like, this collection, Bone and Rag Shop of the Heart, that I love so much. Uh, we have lots of different discussions going on, and that's fantastic. So what that does is it helps us to see that there's something really worth talking about here. There's something really worth talking about here, and there's something that's debatable and discussable. So we're not using the dictionary. And the thesis statement that we're developing using Fry, Pound, Kennedy, and Gayoa needs to have 3 elements to it. So I am going to make some arrows here. There's one arrow. And then we're going to do another arrow. This statement needs to have 3 qualities. It needs to be defensible. That means somewhere in the reading, the statement that you come up with, there needs to be evidence, expert opinion, or evidence in the stories that will support your position. The next thing is it needs to be an argument. You need to be taking a position, and saying that literature can be anything is not really taking a position, because it's just saying, I don't really have anything that I want to talk about. This is why that makes sense. I don't think anybody that I'm discussing, there might be an exception to the rule, but the vast majority of students I've discussed this with face-to-face, I use the example of the television show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. People love this show, right? I don't understand why they love this show. It starts as a script. It starts as text. It has a story. It has plot. It has drama. It has conflict. And it has moments that people find interesting. Again, I don't understand why. But I don't think the majority of students face-to-face all shuddered at the idea of this being considered literature with a capital L. Why? It has all the elements of literature. There's something inherent in something like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or some of these shows that we see on television, these reality television shows. Survivor, for example, might be another example, that we don't want to call it literature for some reason. So there's something distinct to literature, and that's what I'm trying to get you to figure out. And you need to take a stance as to what that distinctness is. How do we know something's literature as opposed to, let's say, scripture, or as opposed to, let's say, entertainment, pure entertainment? Because I think literature has another level above entertainment. Now, you may not think that. You may think literature is just entertaining text. That would be a position, and that would be an argument. You may think that literature must be interesting. We've had this conversation, some of us in the discussion boards, that literature must be interesting to be literature. I have some issues with that, but that's an argument. That's something you can argue. But to say literature is anything is not really to say it is anything at all. In fact, to say literature is anything is to say that it is nothing. It's sort of like saying everything is something is different but similar. Yeah, it is. Who cares? So that's the other thing. It can't simply be a fact statement. Things that are facts are not arguments, and they're not really, they're defensible, but they're not really arguments. So you don't want this to be a fact statement. The other thing, and this might be new for some of you, and for those of you that have had me in the past, it's not that new, is the idea that it needs to be a simple sentence, or at most what we would call a compound sentence. And what this means grammatically for you is that it shouldn't be one of those listing thesis statements. Many students have in the past submitted thesis statements that are a list. What I mean by this are those sentences that go something like this. Let's write it out here so you can see what I'm talking about. Sorry, I'm formatting this as I go. And this is a newer version of Word, so I'm still figuring out where all the bells and whistles are. Okay, so a listing thesis is something like this. Literature is charged language, interesting text, and emotionally relevant writing. That's a listing thesis. It has 3 parts, right? It has those 3 parts, and this is something that we use, writing teachers use, to get students who don't write very often to start writing. And to start thinking about writing. Because what this does is now you have topic sentences for your paragraphs. But at this stage in the game, college students typically are expected to do something a little more, shall we say, advanced. So we don't want a listing thesis. We want a simple or complex sentence thesis. Something like Fry's argument. If you think about, or no, Pound's argument, the idea that literature is news that stays news. That is a thesis. Underneath that thesis, you can have multiple topics that can become the sections of your essay. But that's one sentence. There's not a bunch of lists going on there. Underneath that, literature is news that stays news, you can have a paragraph that deals with charged language. You can have a paragraph that deals with interesting text, interesting ways, unique ways of organizing text. You can have a paragraph that deals with writing that's relevant emotionally to an audience. Or you can look at something like Fry's statement and we can paraphrase it. You know, we can say something like literature, let's take out the spacing so you can see that. Literature does not reflect reality. It swallows it. I love that idea, right? So, and of course that sort of thing you would have to cite appropriately since it comes from Fry. I realize now with the video some of you can't see up here the 3 elements of what a thesis should be. So there they are for you. Defensible, an argument, simple sentence, or compound sentence. And then here you have the listing thesis, which is what a number of students use. And then this is actually what I want, something more along these lines. And you can see how that would help you organize this paper effectively. Okay, so that's developing the thesis, and that's the basics of developing the thesis, the central argument of your paper. The next element that you all should think about is how do I It's going to make me space this down all the way to make another page. Good old Microsoft Office. Cut and paste. They took away my select all. Okay. So the next element y'all should think about when you're approaching your essays is, how do I organize this? How do I organize this in an effective way? So we're going to go here. I'm going to switch this to portrait layout again and do sort of like an outline structure for you. And what I teach my English 1301 students often is a form for their essay where they do the introduction, and the introduction includes an anecdote, which is a story that illustrates the thesis. And that story should lead into the thesis. And then the thesis statement. And then after the introduction, they have the body of the paper. And the body consists of 3 sections. Now notice the term I'm using here is section, not paragraph, because a section sometimes will be multiple paragraphs. Your goal is around 1,200 words for this thing. So it's going to be a sizable paper. Probably one of the most sizable you've written at this point in your academic career. Hopefully you can see why it demands such size. There's a lot of topics, there's a lot to discuss here. So your sections may not be necessarily one single paragraph. They may be multiple paragraphs. Either way, they still kind of follow this pattern that I set up in English 1301 of a topic sentence, an example, an explanation, and notice I'm putting those together now, and a transition. Now, how does this work differently for English 1302 and what we're talking about right now? Well, your topic sentence is going to come from a particular place. It's going to come from the expert opinion. So in this case, your expert opinions are Fry, Pound, and Kennedy, and Jayoa. Those readings. So your topics aren't just being made up out of thin air here. Whatever your thesis statement is, remember, is going to be based on your understanding and based on your thinking and conversations concerning these texts. So in order to organize these subtopics, you need to then refer to the expert opinion. Remember, the essay is one way for me to see that you are reading the assigned text. And in fact, anytime an instructor or professor, this is how this is relevant outside of our class, to future classes, anytime a professor or instructor assigns a writing assignment like this, what they're interested in is how you are reading, understanding, and applying what has been assigned to read for the class. So this is what we mean when we say when you read on the college level, it's not like reading in high school or other levels where you're just reading for information. Here you're actually reading for application, you're reading for synthesis, you're trying to integrate these ideas a little more effectively. Okay, so after that you may go, well, where do the examples come from? The examples actually come from the short stories. And if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. For example, if you want to make the argument that literature, you want to support this idea of charged language presented in Pound, you could look at something like Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, where the punctuation is non-traditional, where the ideas are expressed through odd spellings and terms that are specific to the culture that Jamaica Kincaid is expressing in that. And you can talk about how that language carries a charge because it is representative of the actual character. So you would want to either use direct quote, paraphrase, or summary, depending on what your subtopic is. And then, of course, the transition is where you transition to the next idea, whatever your subtopic is. And you repeat that pattern at least 3 times. But you can do more than 3. There's no rule saying you can't do over 3. I would say less than 3 is not usually good, but you want to do it at least 3 times. Okay, so now the conclusion. The conclusion for the essay is probably the most difficult thing to write, because a lot of students think that they can stop with just reiterating the thesis. Okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but we want our conclusions to be a little more weighty, a little more meaningful. So one of the things I like to do is tell students, and forgive me, I'm going to get up here for a second and grab my copy and put it back on the shelf if I can find it, of Educated Imagination. I was hoping I could find it. Yep, there it is. I have students go and read or reread the last paragraph of Giants in Time to see how Fry concludes. And this last paragraph in Giants of Time is the paragraph where my favorite idea about literature comes from. The writer is neither a watcher nor a dreamer. Literature does not reflect life, but it doesn't escape or withdraw from life either. It swallows it. And the imagination won't stop until it's swallowed everything. No matter what direction we start off in, the signposts of literature always keep pointing the same way, to a world where nothing is outside the human imagination. If even time, the enemy of all living things, and to poets at least the most hated and feared of all tyrants, can be broken down by the imagination, anything can be. We come back to the limit of the imagination that I referred to in my first talk, a universe entirely possessed and occupied by human life, a city of which the stars are suburbs. Think about that. Nobody can believe in any such universe. Literature is not religion, and it doesn't address itself to belief. But if we shut the vision of it completely out of our minds, or insist on its being limited in various ways, something goes dead inside us, perhaps the one thing that is really important to keep alive. So I want you to think, what has he done here in this paragraph? There are 2 things that he does. He reiterates his main idea, right? That literature originates in the imagination. And really what it is us, according to Fry, is us projecting the ideal world onto the real world. I hate that term real, but the world that we experience. That we try to remake the world that we experience into a world of imaginative possibilities. And if you think about it, that is what literature does. And so that's how we can understand it. And I actually lean, I obviously choose to teach Fry to you, so I obviously lean very much toward Fry's ideas. Now, he doesn't stop there, though. He doesn't stop with reiterating his thesis. He goes on to explain why it is important, why this is meaningful, and why, the 15 or so, or 20 or 30 minutes it took you to read this, why that was worth your time. He answers what I often call the so what question. So what? Okay, so our literature is projecting the imagination onto the world. Why is that important? Wouldn't it be better to see the world as it is? And he says here, but if we shut the vision of it completely out of our minds, or insist on its being limited in various ways, it being literature, something goes dead inside us. Perhaps the one thing it is really important to keep alive. So this idea of insisting that literature is frivolous or pointless or not useful actually destroys something in us that makes us distinctly human, according to Fry. So his so what is knowing this, understanding this, thinking about literature in this way is meaningful because it keeps us alive, right? So you want your, I mean, maybe not that dramatic, but you want the last statement in your essay to have some sort of power like that. Because we really are dealing with something here that is an art. It's emotional. It's you can be a bit melodramatic about art. It's okay. You know, if this was a lab report on dissecting a cat, for example, you wouldn't want this level of dramatization in the text. But when you're dealing with something that I think in many ways gets to the root of what it means to be human and what it means to be these storytelling animals that we are, a little bit of drama is okay. So this conclusion needs to be interesting, and it needs to be more than simply the end, or in conclusion, I believe literature is this. In fact, never use the words in conclusion in a conclusion. It should be clear from the tone that it's a conclusion, but it should be meaningful. So for this essay, which you are beginning to work on now, I would assume, the discussion board closes on Monday, on the 1st. Uh, for this essay, please, 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 please uh, have some ambition. Um, really strive to do something meaningful, write something meaningful. Think about these stories as a way to uh, really convince your reader that your view of literature is the correct view. Now, let's talk about evaluation, because that's something students always seem very concerned with. I don't think it's as big a deal, but I know many of you, funding and that sort of thing is tied to your evaluation. So if you look here, I believe I've posted. If I haven't, I will post it shortly. Um, no, I don't actually have it here. There is uh, a new rubric for this class this semester. Let me see if I can find it. I thought I had it here. There it is. This is the new rubric uh, that I've structured here for you. You notice that it has basically two columns, and I will connect it. Let me save it as a PDF. I will post it under this video for you. It has two columns, and the columns uh, are basically pass and fail for each category. So it's a bit more strict than last semester. There's a lot less room for the sorts of things that students often do to try to cover up the fact that they have not read. Uh, and there's a reason for that. Standards are a lot tougher as you progress in college, and I want to make sure that you are reading and thinking. So the artifact does not demonstrate the student has gone through a process to develop his or her thoughts. The artifact is clearly a first draft and contains obvious format, grammar, mechanical errors. I'm not a grammarian, so I'm not hardcore about this sort of thing, but I am going to look at some issues like the use of second person. The artifact demonstrates little evidence that the student has listened to course lectures about the writing process, and are evidence that the student has applied previous feedback to his or her writing to grow as a writer. So one of the things I want to make sure is that I spend time providing feedback for you often, more so at the beginning of the semester, less so at the end of the semester, that you're reading that feedback and actually applying it. The artifact does not include direct and recognizable references to assigned readings. That is key, that you are citing the assigned readings. The artifact includes citations, are clear copy and paste interpretations from websites such as Shmoop Wikipedia, About, SparkNotes, CliffNotes, and any other variant of these sites that summarize text for students. So one of the keys here is that you're going beyond summaries, that you're actually reading the text. It will be clear to me if all you do is go to CliffNotes and read one of their summaries. The artifact does not demonstrate that the student has evaluated assigned text and or approved research for credibility. You need to analyze, use the text that I have assigned first, and then if you want to add extra text to it, you can, but the text that I have assigned need to be the primary text that you are citing this semester. Of course, you will have a chance to do some outside research as part of your research project, but those are also going to be directed assignments. You have to evaluate the sources for their credibility. I've already done a lot of that work for you, so if you are following my instructions and using the sources that I have assigned and reading those, you're fine. If you start using other sources, you run the risk of possibly using a source that's not credible. The artifact does not illustrate the student follows the tone required of an academic or professional communication. If you have any concern about this, let's say you didn't have 1301 with me, there is some documents that I can send out. One of those documents I believe I've posted for you. It's called Things That Make Writing Teachers Cringe. That's a good guide for revision. But there's some other documents out there I can send you too. The artifact has direct commentary to readers. Peers are the instructor. That means that it speaks to me directly about the class itself. Occasionally students will think they are witty and think that it's a good thing to write an essay critiquing the class or critiquing the topic or critiquing the discussion as a whole. This discussion has no point. I have designed the course, and the faculty at this institution and all institutions spend a lot of time and thought and effort into designing courses and attempt to be as fair as possible. So those sorts of conversations have no place in the academic essay. If you want to have that conversation, there are other ways and other avenues to have that. And also the artifact includes logical fallacies. Is also a big issue. And then the key here is that the artifact demonstrate that the student followed MLA conventions. If it doesn't follow MLA conventions, that's the formatting of the paper as set up in your Writing Matters textbook, page 337 for this edition. If it doesn't follow that, if it's not using in-text citations, if there doesn't seem to be an honest effort to follow the rules, that's a fail. So you can see here that it's pretty cut and dry. It's basically all or nothing on each of these topics. Now you can fail one of these things and still pass the others. So there are some opportunities there for leeway. But it's very important that you understand the ramifications of not following the instructions with writing these essays. The essays are weighted a little more so than they were last semester. There are fewer essays, so each one is a little more important. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies any questions you have moving forward. You might not get a lecture video from me next week since you'll be working on the papers, but I'll expect, I will be done grading the discussion forum on Tuesday. I should be posting those grades as the week progresses. Those grades are non-debatable, so don't email me saying, well, why did I receive 20 points instead of 100 points? It's really clearly laid out why you did. Maybe look at the rubric that I provided and the points and start thinking about, well, what can I do next time to make sure I receive all those points? What didn't I do in my responses? And that would be more beneficial than emailing me and being like, about the points. And really focus on these papers. I'm trying to think if there's anything else since the communications might be a little lax this week because of the grading, and next week because of the essays. If anything else does come up, send me specific questions about the topic itself, or if you're struggling with an idea, send me specific questions about that, and I will help you with that. Okay. So I hope this helps, and you know, as we say in the theater, break a leg with the essay. I'm excited to read these, the conversations on the discussion board.